You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 17th of December 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program.
Mit Ja haben gestimmt 207, mit Nein haben gestimmt 394.
Chancellor Olaf Scholz loses a vote of confidence in Germany, prompting political parties to introduce their platforms as federal election campaigning gets underway in earnest. From there to Sudan, which is mired in a devastating conflict that has pulled in the UAE, we'll look at the latest in whether Turkey could play a mediation role. We'll also have the latest business news, and finally,
people don't really go to galleries, but they go to these kinds of events, and it's nice to kind of bring it to them.
Holiday markets in Croatia. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. This is The Briefing, and today marks the official start of the German election campaign after the loss of confidence vote in Germany's parliament yesterday against Chancellor Olaf Scholz. The parties are introducing their platforms and jockeying for position, with everyone but the front-running Christian Democrats hoping there is still time to turn the polls around between now and the 23rd of February. Well, joining us now for more from Berlin is Aaron Burnett, Senior Fellow with the Democratic Strategy Initiative. Aaron, good to have you on the show. Let's start with a word on Olaf Scholz himself yesterday. He gave a pretty combative speech in Parliament before losing the vote of confidence. Was it too little too late?
I mean, he decried the state of Germany's infrastructure. Only 2/3 of German trains are running on time, by the way. That's less than Italy and France, other nations that Germans often like to criticize, when making jokes. For example, he decried the state of digitization, the state of the economy. We are in recession in Germany, actually, and also even warned of the risks of war in Europe, a new war in Europe, and what that meant for German and European security. And really, I sat there watching that speech saying, well, I mean, it sounds like more from a speech that you would expect an opposition leader to be making, not a chancellor who should be defending the record of his government. It was a very odd speech indeed, and certainly one that is preparing for an election campaign, really probably to make some kind of argument that he can govern somehow differently with a different partner. But how he will do that is really anyone's guess.
Well, I mean, Aaron, just to stay on that for a moment, I mean, does that, I guess, show the problems that the coalition government had? He was at the helm of a three-party coalition, which is always, I mean, two parties is difficult enough. Three, perhaps, is almost impossible. I mean, is there something to that, the fact that maybe Scholz was hamstrung, as it were, over the last few years? But that said, this wasn't a side of him. He wasn't complaining about it for the last few years. He's only complaining about it now.
Indeed, that is a good question. However, a lot of the major mistakes of this particular government really land on Scholz's desk. I mean, when we look at, for one thing, the economy and isolation within Europe, just look at the last vote on Chinese tariffs, or rather tariffs on Chinese electrical vehicles. Scholz found himself basically pulling rank through a procedure in German called Richtlinienkompetenz. I will not ask you to repeat that, I promise, which allowed him to override his coalition partners who wanted Germany to vote with most of Europe, actually, and impose tariffs on Chinese vehicles because, and German economists have even warned that our economic model is far too dependent on China, for example, that they are now buying the things or making the things themselves that they used to rely on us for, and that we need to actually properly diversify. That is a question that Scholz absolutely has no answer for. He regularly overrules his own foreign minister when it comes to questions like that. And then when we look at Ukraine, we know that both the Greens and the Free Democrats, his coalition partners, have favored a stronger stance on Ukraine, that he felt pushed into delivering Leopard tanks to Ukraine, and that these two parties actually wanted Taurus cruise missiles to be delivered, and he has stood firm in saying no. Those are just two examples of what I would say plenty of foreign policy experts, certainly, and economists are saying are two of the biggest mistakes that his government has made. And those are mistakes that he has to own because his two coalition partners were not in favor of them anyway. So, I mean, he certainly will try and spin it a certain way that, oh, it's his coalition partners that hamstrung him from getting anything done. But the reality, I think, really is a lot different, personally.
Well, Aaron, let's turn then to the main current opposition leader who is likely to be the next chancellor. That would be Friedrich Merz of the Christian Democrats. Is he any more likely to be an effective leader and sort of avoid some of those mistakes that you're putting at Olaf Scholz's feet?
I mean, that is really a very good question. I mean, when it comes to Ukraine and it comes to European security, we certainly have seen indications that Friedrich Merz favors a much harder line. He has made statements that I would say are very politically difficult to walk back from. Number one, that Ukraine should get an invitation into NATO. And he has said that, or representatives of his party have said that twice, also to international partners. He's also said that he would deliver Taurus cruise missiles to Ukraine. So at the very least on Ukraine and on European security, I think that he is at the very least making a much firmer commitment than Olaf Scholz, one that his allies will certainly expect him to live up to, including, and his Ukrainian partners will expect him to live up to, and that Germans will expect him to live up to, including spending more on defense. On the other issue that we talked about in terms of Olaf Scholz making a lot of mistakes, the economy, that's a whole other question. Friedrich Merz has not shown as of yet that he has a plan that differs really that significantly from Scholz in terms of how do we de-risk from China in Germany? How do we actually revitalize the economic model? How do we make it less dependent on one very authoritarian partner? And how do we actually encourage industries that are not simply legacy car industries, for example, and those other industries that you would generally expect Germany to do very well in? How do we encourage innovation in this economy? This is not something that Friedrich Merz has talked a lot about in terms that I would say are very different from Scholz. So really a very mixed bag, depending on whether you're talking about foreign policy or whether you're talking about the economy.
Well, and just finally, Aaron, when you do look at Friedrich Merz and the Christian Democrats, I mean, whatever happens, even if they are currently in the lead, they are likely to need a coalition partner, whether that is one of the parties currently in government, the Social Democrats, the Greens, or the Free Democrats. Is Merz and his party any more likely to be able to lead a coalition and have a sort of effective agenda and effective sort of a relationship, I guess, with another party in order to get things through in Germany?
I mean, that is really the question of the hour when it comes to who will Merz forge a coalition with. And if we look at his options, I get a lot of questions about whether the CDU will ever work with the AfD. The CDU's own party constitution forbids them from doing so, from working with the far right. So that's not on the table. The Free Democrats might not even make the 5% necessary for getting any seats at all. So we're left with the Social Democrats and the Greens. And there's going to be tension either way. If the CDU goes into a coalition with the Greens, they're really going to have a hard time coming to an agreement on migration, for example. I mean, immigration is absolutely a policy issue where the Greens and the Christian Democrats have very, very different are starting from very different places, particularly the CSU in Bavaria, who would also be involved as well. Even if the CDU and the Greens, who advocate a very tough line on Ukraine, would be able, very natural bedfellows when it comes to foreign policy, not so much with migration. With the SPD, if they govern with them, we could be dealing with the exact opposite problem. They might be the Christian Democrats might be dealing with a party that is much easier to work with. And when it comes to migration, interior policy, a little bit more domestic policy, but foreign policy, how these two parties would see Russia, would see, the biggest security threat that we've seen since World War II in Europe, how they see those things would be very different. So either way, coalition talks are going to be very challenging.
Aaron will be back with you, I'm sure, at some point between now and February. That was Aaron Burnett, Senior Fellow with the Democratic Strategy Initiative in Berlin. Now here's Anita Riota with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. Canada's Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, has resigned over PM Justin Trudeau's spending plans. Several Canadian legislators are now calling on the PM to step down just 1 month ahead of Donald Trump's inauguration. Ukraine has claimed responsibility for assassinating a senior Russian general whom Kyiv accuses of using chemical weapons. The general, Igor Kirillov, is the most senior military officer to be killed in Russia by Ukraine. Germany will join the US and the UK in establishing communication with representatives of the interim government in Syria. Berlin's foreign ministry said a transitional process and a potential diplomatic presence in Damascus will top the agenda. Those are today's headlines. Thanks, Chris. Back to you.
Thanks very much, Anita. To Sudan now, and a conflict that has been less in the headlines than others, but from the perspective of many humanitarian organizations and the United Nations, is the most devastating war in the world today. Efforts have been underway by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and others to broker a ceasefire, but with few results in a murky civil war that has also drawn in outside powers, including the United Arab Emirates, which is accused of backing Sudanese rebels. Well, Yasmin Abdelmajid is a Sudanese-Australian writer and broadcaster and joins me now. Yasmin, good to have you on the show. I suppose by way of summarizing why Sudan has descended into another civil war over the past year and a half, is it fair to say that there are no good sides in this conflict?
Yes, Chris, I think it is fair to say there are no good sides. The special envoy from the US, Tom Perello, described it as a bad side and a worse side. And from the perspective of Sudanese people, ultimately what we're looking at is both sides, as you were, used to be under the same umbrella, and they sort of combined forces to resist or overthrow the People's Revolutionary Movement. And now there is this sort of battle for overall supremacy. And both sides think that they will be able to win militarily, but this is not a war that will end militarily, because it's a political conflict. And even though it is often described as a civil war, and many Sudanese do describe it as a civil war, it's also useful to think of it as a counter-revolutionary war, a war that is about the spoils of the state as opposed to any functional state at the end of it.
Yasmin, I can't help but be reminded of what we've been covering recently when it comes to that, and that would be Syria, because it is, I suppose, one of these questions, isn't it, of what happens when a dictator is toppled. Do you get any sense that either side in this war in Sudan want a ceasefire at this point after nearly 2 years of war? I mean, how intractable is this?
Chris, neither side would benefit from a ceasefire, really. And this is part of the problem. Right now, there is no actual incentive. I mean, over the course of the last sort of almost 20 months, we've seen various attempts at peace talks, whether it's in Geneva, whether it's in Saudi Arabia, whether it's, in other countries in the east of Africa. Ultimately, the various people attending they're forum shopping. They're going around and saying, yes, we will, we'll put our guns down. But then literally not doing anything, and there is no leverage over either side to force them to do anything. Now, the EU, there was just an announcement overnight that the EU has placed sanctions over against a number of officials, 4 senior officials from both the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces. The United States has also offered or placed some sanctions, but these are not strong enough levers over any members of the conflict, partly because both sides are able to continue to gain, they've got weapons coming in, they've got income coming in, they are actually able to send gold out, send livestock out, they are able to sustain this war. And so for the individuals and the groups benefiting, there is what would be the value ultimately in ending the war? Well, all of the groups would have to deal in a system where they are not they cannot be the sort of the overall winners. And so, I mean, it's devastating, really, because as you mentioned at the top, this has become the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. Some say it's the worst humanitarian crisis on record. The number of people that have been killed, the number of people that require aid, amount of famine. We've seen the return of cholera. We've seen the return of dengue fever. It's a really dire situation. We're talking man-made famine. There is no need for people in Sudan to starve. But unless we see genuine movement from those who are fueling the fire, as it were, and this is an interesting parallel with Syria, whether it is the UAE, whether it is, Turkey thinks it can bring people to the table in a serious way. That remains to be seen. But unless the people fueling either side of the conflict really decide that the cost of the conflict is too high, it's not going to change.
Well, and tell us a little bit more about that, Yasmin, because as you suggest there, if there is going to be leverage that can be exercised on the two parties, it might come from abroad, it might come from the UAE, it might come from Turkey. Why is it that neither of these sides, some of those regional players that are involved, don't have an interest in ending this themselves? And also a bit more perhaps on Turkey. Do you have any sense that, given that Turkey has a stronger position perhaps now in the region, also because of Syria, might it have some strength as a mediator?
So for people that are interested in thinking of how the world is shifting and how power centers are shifting geopolitically, I do think the conflict in Sudan is interesting, because 20 years ago, this was the kind of war that the United States could, unilaterally almost put a stop. I mean, we saw that with Darfur, the genocide in Darfur, the involvement of the United States really accelerated the end of that genocide. We are now in a situation where power is a lot more diffuse, and where you're seeing the grappling of within the region. Yes, you've got the UAE. Yes, you've got Saudi Arabia. Yes, you've got Turkey. You've got this grappling, and it's not entirely clear how it's going to pan out. Now, the UAE, for example, is an interesting one, because some have said that Sudan is a bit of collateral damage. The United States and other Western powers need the UAE on side for other, as an ally in other conflicts in the region, and so they're not going to push too hard. I also think, though, that the UAE maybe got in a little too far and didn't quite realize what they were getting into when they got involved with Sudan in the way that they have, and so are now in a situation where, they might want to pull back, but they are quite dependent from a gold point of view, from a wanting to purchasing land point of view. So there still is a benefit for them in kind of maintaining that relationship. The other thing to note is that there is a potential fracturing happening. Right now, the rebels, the militia, the Sudanese Rapid Support Forces are talking about having a separate government. They are in conversations right now talking about forming a separate government, which would be the East and the South. Now, if this is not something that anybody really wants, the Taqaddum, which is a group of sort of civil, a group of civilians who don't represent all the civilians, but represent some of the civil or the civic movement. They absolutely don't want that. International actors don't want that. But if you've got a situation where the Rapid Support Forces decide they're going to form a government over here, the traditional armed forces have the East, and they're still grappling over the center, I think regional powers are looking at this and thinking, shall we just wait till and see how it shakes out, and then we can decide who we negotiate with? There's still a lot to play for. Just to answer finally, in terms of Turkey is trying to position itself as one of the power brokers in the region. Obviously, there's a bit of history with the UAE there, but also most recently, we saw they were able to negotiate between Ethiopia and Somalia and bring them together over an issue to do with Somaliland and some sovereignty. That was a big win for Erdogan. However, whether or not, even though Erdogan has now said, I think I can bring people to the table, whether or not there will be enough leverage from Turkey's point of view, we would be considering things like support of weapons and so on, that remains to be seen.
Yasmin Abdel-Majid, thank you very much for unpacking all of that for us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. I'm Chris Chermak, and it's time now for the latest business headlines. And for that, we are joined by the Bloomberg reporter, Ewan Potts. Ewan, we're going to start in the U.S., which does have a debt problem as we look at the arrival of the next administration under Donald Trump. What are bond investors saying at the moment?
Hello, Chris. Yeah, the US government is forecast to borrow close to $2 trillion next year, $2 million. Now, that's clearly a big number. Just to put it in a bit of context, that is 6% of GDP, 6% of total US economic output next year. Now, if the US were in a recession, that would be perhaps understandable. That's the kind of amount of money that governments borrow when times are tough and they need to fuel the economy. But the US is not in a recession. The US economy is doing very well. GDP has been growing strongly. The job market is robust. So the US is borrowing really more than it should. Now, the question is, how long can it carry on doing this? One senior investor today predicting that US Treasury yields, the 10-year Treasury yield, could climb from the current level of around 4.5% to perhaps as much as 6% over the course of next year. Now, that's not the consensus forecast, but it is one forecast. Now, that would be bad news for anybody borrowing money, not least the US government. Now, the man charged with, at least nominally in charge of the Treasury, who's in charge of sorting out this mess, is Scott Bessent, his Trump's pick for the Treasury Secretary. And he has to deal with quite a lot of things, really. Donald Trump has promised to cut a number of taxes, not least the tax on tips. He's promised all sorts of other giveaways as well. And he also says he won't touch entitlements such as Medicare and Medicaid, which absorb a lot of US government spending. We do know on the other side of the ledger, Elon Musk has promised to cut government spending as far as he can. But really, at the moment, bond investors have got no idea of just what shape the US government deficit is going to take. So a pretty nervous time to be holding all those US government bonds.
And Ewan, it's interesting when you describe all of that, particularly because, of course, when Republicans are in opposition, they certainly bill themselves as the party to tackle debt and the party of smaller government. But as you suggest there, I suppose, investors don't necessarily see Donald Trump as the man who will actually do that.
No, indeed. Republicans like to consider themselves fiscal hawks, if you like. But I think if you look at the track record of the various presidents going back over the last 20 or 30 years or so, none of them has been particularly hawkish. And the US government debt has just continued to grow. Certainly over the last 4 years of our Democratic president, Joe Biden has spent a huge amount of money. Of course, we've had to come through the COVID pandemic where all governments spent a lot of money, borrowed money. But Biden's administration has chosen to introduce things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which was in many ways just a huge wall of government spending and borrowing. And that has pushed the deficit to this 6% level, which is really unprecedented for what you might call peacetime. But Donald Trump has talked about getting the deficit down. Scott Bessent, the Treasury pick, says he wants to get it down to 3% over the next 3 years. But quite how they're going to get there, I think that detail is really not out there.
Well, one other story we did want to ask you about, Ewan, residents of Denmark are learning to deal with the success of their largest company, you say. Why are they learning to deal with it?
Yeah, it's a nice problem to have. Denmark, population 6 million, is home to Novo Nordisk. Now, many people in Europe perhaps wouldn't have heard of this company, but it is actually the biggest company, the most valuable company in Europe. Its main market is the United States. It's the maker of Ozempic and Wegovy, the two blockbuster drugs to treat diabetes and weight loss. The company is really enormous. It'll actually contribute about half of Denmark's 2.5% GDP growth this year. And it's building a new $1.2 billion factory in Denmark, just announced this yesterday, to increase production capacity for its rare disease treatments, presumably obesity not being one of those. It's on the outskirts of Denmark's third largest city, Odense, and it will create 400 permanent jobs with potential for future expansion. So that's all great news. But it's not so great news if you have to compete with Novo Nordisk. We spoke to a small business owner which operates in the shadow of one of the company's existing plants. It's a car service shop which was operating very successfully for a number of years, but it's just closed down after 8 years of operation. And its problem wasn't a lack of custom, but was a lack of staff. Every time they got a good employee, Novo Nordisk would come along and offer a pay rise of 20%, and the employee would be off. So small businesses really struggling to find staff when there's such a massive company with a great big sucking noise in the labour market. So it's a nice problem in a way, but it's interesting to think of some of the problems of success.
Absolutely. Very interesting to hear about that impact on small businesses. Ewan Potts, Bloomberg reporter, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And finally, on today's show, Croatia's capital, Zagreb, is now well established as one of Europe's top seasonal destinations. That's down to its Christmas markets, which have won multiple awards and feature in many of this year's festive must-visit lists. Not bad considering that Zagreb Advent only got underway in earnest a decade ago. Monocle's man in the Balkans, Guy Delany, went along to find out why it's such a festive success.
Welcome to Zagreb Advent. This is the undisputed regional champion of Christmas markets. The events take over pretty much the whole city, with more than 24 locations offering some sort of seasonal shenanigans. And by that, I don't just mean the usual mulled wine and sausage stalls, but all sorts of live music, art installations, and an absolutely epic ice skating park. No wonder it was declared Europe's top Christmas market 3 times in a row before it was barred from running again. And that reputation is pulling in punters from near and far, not just from around the country, but across Europe and even further afield.
We had people from South America, we have people from all over Europe, we had a nice lady from Armenia, literally from all over the world.
Mario Stojanovic runs a food stall at the Christmas market on Zagreb's main square.
I think the locations are really well thought. The offer is really good. I think most of the booths are really trying to offer something unique, and we have that warm hospitality that's famous for Croatian people. So everybody should come and check it out, I think.
We've gone through a metal door and into the Grič tunnel, which runs into the hillside in the middle of Zagreb, but it's really like we've stepped through a portal into a totally different realm, because all around us are icebergs and projections on shards of glass of animals which roam the polar tundra. There's music as well, and in the middle, a centerpiece, the Polar Express itself, a rather large model train, a little bit temperamental, which turns around in a circle on a beautifully wrought metal platform.
So we built this little train station, houses and icebergs.
Andrej Bestak is one of the creators of the Polar Express, along with Anja Lekpa.
We wanted to make something that feels very Christmassy but doesn't have these usual symbols.
How important is it, do you think, that Zagreb Advent has different things like what's going on here in the tunnel?
People don't really go to galleries, but they go to these kinds of events, and it's nice to kind of bring it to them.
I wouldn't want anyone to get the idea that Zagreb Advent is only for chin-stroking aesthetes. There is, of course, a major element of good old-fashioned winter bacchanal in play here. There are sausages, stew and stuffed cabbage rolls, as well as mulled wines, hot cocktails and rakia. But here, on the terrace of the historic Hotel Esplanada, there's also a little refinement. The market here is known as fooling around, and they're not messing with the food and drink on offer, with Michelin-starred snacks among the temptations for the punters.
We realized that sausages and mulled wine, it was boring for us as well. So we wanted to do something that we would enjoy. So we were the first to introduce the real chefs from the really good restaurants on the street.
Zrinka Farina is one of Fooling Around's organisers.
We are really trying to give the upscale experience for all the gourmet lovers, for people who can really appreciate good restaurants. And every year we are trying to bring more and more sophisticated menus and better chefs.
You say that it's upscale and sophisticated, but it's not intimidating. And I mean that in terms of price as well. If you come here and you want to get some food from, and if we turn around and we look here, we've got a Michelin star over there on that sign which says Noel. We've got stuff from the Esplanade Hotel. We've got the JRE Young Chefs sign as well as over there too. This isn't going to set you back an arm and a leg.
No, because the chefs really see this as a also chance for them to experiment, to see if they can put the haute cuisine dishes in a street food format, and they're very precise, they're very passionate, very talented. So we have some of the best places from Korčula, from Brač, from all over Croatia here, and this moment it's a haute cuisine brought to street food format.
Karlo Božgajčić u ulozi Orašara.
The opening of the ice park officially got Zagreb Advent underway at the start of the month. This almost absurdly expansive skating paradise meanders around Tomislav Square, with icy trails to explore as well as a main rink. It's opposite the city's railway station, which used to be a stop on the Orient Express. These days, it's where visitors arrive on special trains from neighbouring Hungary and Slovenia. And hitting the ice park first is only fitting, because that's where Zagreb Advent, as we now know it, started.
In 2014, when Ice Park was introduced, Advent really grew. It really made its signature on the Advent map of Europe.
Slavica Olic-Klapčić organises both the Ice Park and events in nearby Zrinjevac Park, Zagreb's original Christmas market venue.
Advent is not only the locations with the huts. We're talking about hotels and a lot of visitors coming, restaurants, shops. So I think for the economy of the city, it's actually fantastic.
Can you put numbers on it?
We're talking about 500,000 people.
All this merriment means big business for Zagreb. The tourist board puts up less than €1 million to support the various locations and cultural programmes. But the result is a bonanza for Zagreb's hospitality sector. Last December it pulled in more than €100 million. That's a rise of 25% year on year, and it's hoping for even more this festive season. Slavica Olic-Klapčić thinks the future's bright.
Whoever is creative and who would like to do this job has a chance for it, which is fantastic. I think the whole Advent in Zagreb can really develop into something even bigger but nicer.
It's enough to leave other European cities quaking in their winter boots. The Croatian capital's laid down a challenge. If they want to win the prize for the continent's best Christmas market, they've got a festive fight on their hands. For Monocle, in Zagreb, I'm Guy Delaunay.
Thank you very much, Guy. We'll definitely have to add Zagreb to my Christmas market list. And that's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Anita Riota, our researcher was Maisie Ringer, and our studio manager was Steph Chungu. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Termack. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.